Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of Novel Approaches, a close readings podcast series from the London Review of Books. I'm Thomas Jones, a senior editor at the paper, and joining me today to talk about Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens are Tom Crewe and Rosemary Hill. Tom Crewe is a contributing editor at the LRB. His novel, The New Life, which won the Orwell Prize for Political Fiction, among several other awards, is set in late 19th century London. Hello, Tom, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, it's a pleasure.
Rosemary Hill is also a contributing editor at the LRB, and her books include a biography of Pugin, a history of Stonehenge, and most recently Times Witness, History in the Age of Romanticism. She last appeared on this podcast talking about Vanity Fair. Hello, Rosemary, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you back.
Hello, thank you. Lovely to be back.
So Our Mutual Friend, which was published in 19 instalments between 1864 and 1865, was Dickens's last completed novel. He died in 1870, leaving the mystery of Edwin Drood mysteriously unfinished. Critical opinion of Our Mutual Friend has fluctuated over the years. Reviewing it for The Nation in 1865, Henry James wrote that seldom had we read a book so intensely written, so little seen, known or felt. But Tim Parks in the LRB in 2013 called it a wonderful kaleidoscope of exclusions and inclusions and a tribute to Dickens's genius and energy. So we'll see where we fall on that spectrum today. But to begin, Tom, perhaps you could tell us a bit about where Our Mutual Friend fits into Dickens's life and times.
Of course. Well, I think Dickens led such an action-packed life, and it's a familiar life to lots of people, so I'll try and skim along to get to Our Mutual Friend. But it's worth just saying that he, of course, had this famously rackety childhood, sort of the lower end of the middle class, ended up working in the blacking factory, a traumatic childhood experience, which was later recapitulated in David Copperfield. He became a journalist after a few detours. He wrote his sketches by Boz, which were collected in 1836. And this began a really wonderful and rather staggering decade or more of achievement, beginning with the Pickwick Papers, taking in Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, The Old Curiosity Shop, Barnaby Rudge, Martin Chuzzlewit, The Christmas Carol, Dombey and Son. That's all between 1837 and 1848. And traditionally, critics tend to see this as a bit of a turning point, with Dombey and Son ushering in a new era where he moves away from the more picaresque Fielding and Smollett-influenced era of his youth towards more carefully planned novels that have more elaborate plots, are more deliberately, concentratedly making various forms of social critique, and in fact almost always tend to address the issue of money in various ways. And I think we can see that as a response to the mid-Victorian moment. I mean, I don't think it's coincidental we have this shift around 1848 because we're moving into this mid-Victorian age of boom, the railways, the banks, and this sense of settled complacency about Britain's place in the world and its grandeur and success and achievement, which Dickens was pretty keen to undermine in various ways. So we then have this sort of second era of Dickens's career: David Copperfield, Bleak House, Hard Times, Little Dorrit, The Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations, which are the two novels which precede Our Mutual Friend. They were both published in weekly serial in his new magazine all the year round. So we pick up with him now. He finished Great Expectations in 1861, and he didn't begin Our Mutual Friend for 2 years, which for him was quite an unusual gap. So he didn't start writing it until October of 1863. I think there are various reasons for this. He'd had this famous personal crisis, very public personal crisis, in 1859 when he separated from his wife and felt he had to explain this to the public, including publishing his explanation in his own magazine. He'd also began at that same year, again, perhaps not coincidentally, began his great series of public readings for the first time, reading from his books professionally for paying audiences. And this was an incredibly intensive process. It wasn't at all that he was simply opening his books and reading from the pages. He was shaping new texts that were particularly crafted for public audiences. So it was a very intensive process, and the performances were very acted. They were real performances, and they took a lot out of him, particularly because his health was bad by this point in his life. He had an exhausting social life. He was always charging around London and rowing and climbing mountains, and he was a very, very busy man. He was editing his magazines. He was very involved in various charitable endeavours. So he was very, very active in this period before he beginning Our Mutual Friend, and just around the same time his mother died, his son Walter died, both in 1863. Another relevant thing, I think, particularly for Our Mutual Friend to bear in mind, is that he had sold his house, Tavistock House, in 1860 to a Jewish couple, Mr. and Mrs. Davis, and they had become friendly afterwards, and Mrs. Eliza Davis in 1863 had complained about his portrayal of Fagin in Oliver Twist, suggesting that it reinforced Jewish stereotypes about Jewish people, negative stereotypes. Perhaps this was, I'm not quite sure, perhaps it was because he's performing as Fagin in public. Perhaps this has brought the character back into the public domain in a particularly pointed way. So I think Dickens was very shocked by this allegation. He was upset that he could be seen to be enforcing a stereotype, and so he developed the character of Mr. Rear in Our Mutual Friend, who plays an important role, a rather saintly character, who I'm sure we will discuss later on. He found the going quite hard on Our Mutual Friend once he had begun in October 63. As you say, it was going to be published in 19 serial instalments, and he waited until he had 5 in hand, 5 already written, before he began publishing it in serial, hoping that by those means he could get ahead of the publishing schedule. And it also reflects the difficulty he had getting the story going in his own mind. As it was, in the end, he ended up in his familiar position of being only one ahead of the publisher, which was rather stressful for him. And if that wasn't enough, shortly before finishing the book, and he alludes to this in his postscript, he was involved in a terrible railway accident, the Staplehurst rail disaster, in which I think 11 people were killed. This was when he was returning from Paris with his mistress, Ellen Ternan, and he was a really awful accident. He was very involved in helping people get out and pulling people from the wreckage. And not only did he pull people from the wreckage, but he pulled the manuscript of Our Mutual Friend. I think it was part 16. He pulled it from the wreckage, and he alludes to this at the end of the book. So we were lucky to have him and to have Bella Wilfer's wedding, thanks to his survival. So yes, and the book was finished in 1865, and it was his last completed book, as you say.
And as you say, he stresses in the postscript that he didn't go to rescue his characters, as he puts it, the manuscript, until all the people who could be rescued were rescued. So very important to put the people first. Right. So yeah, you mentioned a couple of the characters, that Mr. Rear and Bella Wilfer, and as with so many of Dickens's novels, it's full of characters, and even in sort of the last couple of chapters, he's still introducing new comic characters. That mention nearly towards the end of Mrs. Sprodgkin, who you feel could have been a great comic character throughout the book. But we should go back to the beginning. It's a long novel, even by Dickens's standards, nearly twice as long almost as its immediate predecessors, A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations, and its plot or plots are quite convoluted, but we will do our best to untangle them. So it begins with one of Dickens's great set-piece openings on the River Thames, between Southwark Bridge, which is of iron, and London Bridge, which is of stone, as an autumn evening was closing in. And a body is fished from the river. So whose body is it, Rosemary? Or rather, whose body does everyone believe it to be?
Well, it is the body of the mutual friend. And who the mutual friend is going to be, we're not quite clear. I mean, Dickens, of course, claimed afterwards that we were supposed to know right from the beginning who was pulled out of the river. But I think that's rather disingenuous, because actually it isn't clear. Nothing is clear, except for the fact that the river and the murk and the darkness of London is going to be central to the novel. And also this idea of friends and identity, which comes up over and over again, because a mutual friend is possibly everyone's friend or possibly nobody's friend. So our mutual friend might be, I might assume you know him very well. You might assume I know him very well. Neither of us might really know him. So I think that gets launched very quickly, this idea of how do people know each other in this dark, murky city? So somebody is pulled out of the river, and I think, and also, of course, we very early on see one of the principal characters, Lizzie Hexam, who is rowing the boat. She's rowing a boat on the Thames. So she's immediately appears as one of those, I mean, physically, she's a powerful, it's not easy to row a boat that size on the Thames. She's quite a sturdy and powerful woman. She's not one of Dickens' flopsy flower girls.
And the body is taken out, is taken to a pub, first of all, for an inquest, and it's then taken to the police station. And it's identified as this man, John Harmon, right, who's returning from South Africa to claim his inheritance from his late father, who was also called John Harmon, who's a rubbish collector and had made his fortune by collecting and sifting and dispersing rubbish. And a very horrible old man who has left this will with all sorts of awkward stipulations in it. And because his son has washed up dead, his wealth and his fortune and his mounds of dust and his house are left to a couple who used to work for him, Mr. and Mrs. Boffin.
Yes, and the Dickens, of one of the many things, people always complain with Dickens that things are incredible, and he was always at pains to point out that most of these things are not incredible. But the point about the will, which everyone is talking about, is that young Harmon can only inherit if he marries this woman whom he has never met, Bella Wilfer. And it's an extremely strange condition, but it hovers in the background even while we are, or are we not, under the impression that John Harmon, the heir, has drowned.
And I think the reason that that horrible old Mr. Harmon wanted his estranged son to marry Bella Wilfer is because he once saw her as a little girl hitting her father with her bonnet, and so thought she was it's a sort of punishment to everyone, to make, this apparently horrible little girl can marry his son and they'll all make each other miserable, and sort of from beyond the grave he's laughing at them. And the Boffins, feeling bad for Bella Wilfer, she can't marry into this fortune. They sort of adopt her and they take her in. But we learn about all this, Tom, don't we? So we see that some of this happening in the murk on the river. And then in one of these characteristic Dickensian leaps across London, where Harmon's solicitor, Mortimer Lightwood, is at dinner at the Veneerings. So who are the Veneerings and their dinner guests?
Well, the Veneerings, as their name would suggest, are a very superficial couple. They are all surface and no depth. No one really knows where they come from. It's ironic that the story of John Harmon is told as the story of the man from nowhere, but really it's the Veneerings that have come from nowhere. No one knows who they are or where they've come from. We begin with poor old Mr. Twemlow, who is, as Dickens wonderfully has it, sort of employed as though he's a table, and he's such a regular feature of people's dinners that it's though he is the table, and he is pulled out in leaves to include more people. It's one of the most wonderful passages in Dickens, I think. And poor Mr. Twemlow begins by wondering how is it that he is Mr. Veneering's oldest friend? Can it be true that he is his oldest friend? Because he's only known him about 2 weeks. So the Veneerings are this upstart couple. All they're doing is hosting dinners, inviting people they don't know. And another wonderful feature is that people, when they're at the Veneerings' dinners, ignore the Veneerings. They talk to each other, but they deliberately don't talk to the Veneerings because no one understands what they're doing there. But they do happily partake of the dinners, which are apparently very good. So we have this wonderful chapter. Dickens writes in the present tense. He switches into the present tense when he describes the Veneerings, which gives it this air of reportage. It gives it this, I guess it almost gives it this kind of dashing, superficial feel. We have the kind of the eye of Dickens passing along the table. He actually looks at the Veneerings and their guests in the mirror. We sort of examine them again. This sense of distance and superficiality and
yes, in the sense that they have no past.
Yes.
So why would you can't talk about them in the past tense because there isn't a past tense.
Exactly.
And Twemlow is the only one who actually emerges later on as really rather good figure,
yes.
But he's the only one who is not such a cynic as to really wonder. All the others know exactly what's going on, they just don't care.
Yes, exactly. So there they all are. We have this wonderful passage introducing them, and we get the measure of them very quickly. And the story is told. Mortimer Lightwood begins to tell the story of his client, this mysterious will, and everyone's very gripped by the story, and we're brought up to speed. But the chapter ends with Mortimer Lightwood getting this note telling him that the body has been found and the body has been identified as John Harmon. And from then on, these characters reappear. They're the objects of Dickens's probably most pointed satire in the novel. And Mortimer and his dearest friend Eugene Raeburn become prominent figures. They're both aristocratic, semi-aristocratic, gentlemanly at least, figures who affect boredom and cynicism and are very hard to impress. So in fact, they tell the truly miraculous story of John Harmon in the most drawling, relaxed fashion. It's very Wildean, in fact. It's an interesting example of Dickens seeming to gesture in this novel to literary fashions that are still to come.
And also, of all the guests who feature at the Veneerings, by far the most repulsive is Lady Tippings, who has been who puts herself together. And I mean, it's really a vile portrait of an ageing lady who's always flapping her fan and pretending that they're all her admirers. And the ghastly moment when Raeburn and Mortimer Lightwood go to see the body that's been brought out of the river, and Raeburn says, it's not much worse than Lady Tippins, really. It's very gross, but extremely funny.
And almost as bad as Lady Tippins is Mr. Podsnap, who is also at the dinner, and he stands for this mid-Victorian complacency. He has this habit of dismissing with a sweep of his hand inconvenient facts that include the existence of other countries, their possible claims to their own kinds of greatness, and also the existence of social perils and suffering in Britain. They're all swept away by this supremely condescending and chauvinistic man, Mr. Podsnap. And he also stands for a more settled wealth and a more settled position than the Veneerings, but it's something that's equally, in its own way, vulgar and crass and complacent.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast. Or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.